The last few days, I must confess, I've been quite troubled at night. I think I have ghosts in the bedroom. And it hasn't happened for many years, not since I was last teaching in a strange school in Suffolk, and I was living in an old, battered house, and I was quite convinced it was haunted. And it was quite disturbing. Every night at 3 o'clock there would be noises, and there would be this sense that there was something in my room. I think there was something in my classroom as well. Anyway, uh, it's made me realise the problem with the election. It's not, the election wasn't won by Labour. The election was lost by the Conservatives, and why? And why? Partly because of Nigel Farage, and partly because events had conspired that reminded us of the past. So I was interested in things that various people have said. Drop Dude John says, offering the youth no real future by telling them that they need to open the country up to mass immigration, or telling children that when they grow up and reach puberty they will be neutrals, will be the downfall of this lot. I don't agree with you, I'm afraid. I think um, I think we are open to mass migration, and we need mass migration. I'm not suggesting we should have an open door policy, but I think we should be realistic, and I think we should not be punishing one group for the faults of others. We should be a welcoming country. We are British not because of our birth, but because of the principles and the virtues that we practice and that we preach. And we embrace others. That's been our history for thousands of years, 2,000 of years. We have had a history of welcoming people to our country and being transformed by and transforming them. Now is not the time to change that. Alf Smith says, you're spot on about the demographic of Boston and Skegness, but the Eastern Europeans have voted for reform, thinking that they aren't on the list of people to get rid of. I'm afraid you're probably right. I'm afraid you're probably right. John Curtis, the psephologist, says that voters base their contempt for the Conservatives on two things: Partygate and Liz Truss. And it was not the D-Day escapade that did for Rishi, it was the Gamblegate nonsense of his parliamentary private secretary and his campaign spads. They reminded the people who were voting of the casual attitude of Johnson and Partygate. Two things, just as sentences. Just as sentences you hear can suddenly change their meaning when they acquire new meanings because of resonance, when events conspire. There's a wonderful line in The King and I, the musical, Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, where the king comes to the front of the stage and he says, one day, facing threats from Cambodia, I want to build a fence around Siam. And it's not a joke in the original text. It's not a joke. But when it's played today, in the memory of the xenophobia of Trump and Farage and Braverman, it raises a roaring laugh from any audience that's watching. As for Nigel Farage's impact on the Labour victory and the Conservative defeat in the election, this can be understood more deeply. First of all, Farage's Reform Party split the vote, siphoned off a significant portion of the Conservative vote. John Curtis, again, noticed that in around two-thirds of the seats the Conservatives lost, Reform UK voters could have tipped the balance had they supported the Conservatives. Now, this vote split and weakened the Conservative stronghold in crucial constituencies. Conservative MPs running around the place talking about Reform UK as bindweed in the garden. Yes, completely strangling the fresh shoots of growth. The second thing is Labour had a strategic advantage. Its landslide was not due to their campaign, but because of the fragmented right-wing vote. The campaign of Labour was to carry the Ming vase across the floor and not drop it. Keir Starmer knew full well what an opportunity he had been gifted by the fractured right-wing vote. While Labour's votes, for example, didn't dramatically increase in Wales and barely changed in England, the Conservative losses to Reform UK were instrumental in Labour's victory. Yes, there was a lot of tactical voting, but it was the fragmenting of the right-wing vote that really did for the Conservative Party, and the voters who stayed at home because they simply do not embrace the former Conservative voters who kept saying in swathes either they were staying at home or they were going to vote for the Lib Dems or they were going to vote for Labour. This wasn't because the Lib Dem vote appealed, because the Labour policies appealed, or because the Lib Dem policies appealed. It's because the Conservatives were no longer the place where they found a political home, because the Conservatives had lurched so firmly to the right, so firmly into the pocket of Braverman and Patel and Cleverly and Farage. And his presence, Farage's presence, was particularly felt in places like Clacton, where he won his first Commons seat, but also across the east in unexpected outcomes like Liz Truss's defeat. Why was Liz Truss so roundly routed? Well, partly because of the turnip Taliban and the frustration. People weren't necessarily going to vote for an independent, but they might well decide not to vote for Liz Truss. If Liz Truss is all the Conservatives can put up as a candidate, I'd rather stay at home. Farage's influence, I think, was there. Reform UK's impact. And actually, the size of the vote that they took, I think 9,000 votes in Liz Truss's former constituency. Reform UK's impact extended beyond their own wins, as their presence significantly altered the dynamics in many constituencies. Sunak's decision to call a snap election was a miscalculation as well, allowing Farage to return to the political fray, galvanise support for reform, and all on because Rishi Sunak didn't have the political experience to know really what he was doing, what he was risking. He underestimated Farage's influence, which was a fatal error in the context of the election. And the point was, because Farage is a gadfly, because Farage is about the attracting the vote of the discontented, it doesn't matter how many mistakes he makes. If it is simply the protest vote, he could stand on his head and drop his trousers. People would still vote for him in their swarms because they don't want to vote for Liz Truss, because they don't want to vote for the Conservative candidate, because they want to give Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives a bloody nose, because they don't like the lurch to the right. It's got nothing to do. Suella Braverman came up and said, she said we haven't got it right because we haven't been true Conservatives, because what's she saying? She's saying we need to be more to the right to get that vote back. No, she is a fool. But she's not the only fool, so because she's speaking in her own little echo chamber, she thinks she's supported. And she may well be. The Conservative Party will never recover if that's the direction it goes. If it goes in the direction of Suella Braverman, that is the end of the Conservative Party. I think Reform UK poses a long-term challenge for both Labour and the Conservatives. Labour will need to address the reform threat in its heartlands to secure a second term, which means it has to sort out the migrant problem. Now, it doesn't have to take the same solution. It doesn't have to find an alternative deterrent that isn't Rwanda. The idea of deterrence is absurd. When people have run away from their homeland, that is deterrent enough. They have faced enough deterrent. They're not going to be deterred by some ridiculous second-rate government saying, I'm deterring you by sending you to some other country. It's not a deterrent. That's a wheeze. That's a trick. That's a delay. Not a deterrent. When people have risked their lives to cross the sea, there is no deterrent available. What we have to do is process the application. And if they don't meet the criteria, send them on. Now, the Italians understand that. They've done a deal with Albania so that Albania will hold these people while they're processing the applications. And those people who don't meet the criteria, well, maybe they'll settle in Albania. Maybe Albania can move them on to some other country. Many people cannot be returned to their country of origin. How can you return somebody to Iran when our relationship with Iran is so fractured? You can't. So the whole problem of Farage and the far right complicates the Conservative Party's efforts to return to power, and also the threat that this poses to the Labour Party in government. Aligning too closely with Reform UK will alienate Conservative centrist voters and will wipe out the Conservatives. Does that mean the Labour Party should do its very best to keep the bickering going on? No, it's not in the interests of the Labour Party to have this disease running riot. Labour needs to tackle migration. Labour needs to remove it. And actually, Reform will disappear because it will have no purpose. Reform is about protest, but it's about one specific solution and one specific craze, which is xenophobia. Remove the migration issue, remove the people in hotels, and Reform is emasculated almost at that moment. It's as if you're taking Reform to the vet. And the defeat has left a leadership void in the Conservative Party, and that will need to be filled. Penny Mordaunt isn't available. Tom Tugendhat probably doesn't have the power to command the rump. This is something which is very, very likely to go the way of Suella Braverman, Penny, Priti Patel, James Cleverly. Of those, James Cleverly is possibly the mildest problem for Labour and for the country. But it's in the interests of Labour that this right-wing lurch is not so violent as to knock out the Conservative Party for more than a generation. I think the best government is one that is challenged from within its own party and from the opposition. I think the best government is one that communicates. And Keir Starmer has demonstrated on many an occasion that he wants that sort of communication. Not the artificial communication of PMQs, but a real communication where serious interplay, serious exchange of thoughts takes place. That will only happen when the threat of Farage is nullified. Farage is the vermiculous slime, the infestation of xenophobic unpleasantness. Sometimes we need worms. Sometimes we need worms. We actually do need worms. And Farage has a purpose. But that purpose is to be buried so far underground that all he can do is make better things grow. Yes, Farage has purpose, and that is to eat the dirt, the waste that others leave behind. Farage is a bottom feeder, and he's best seen, or rather not seen and not heard. But at the moment, we've done too much stamping. The worms have come to the surface, and we are about to be overridden by these worms. But they are worms. They are just worms. They are not snakes. They are not vipers. They are not really dangerous. They're just messy and unsightly. They need to be put back in their place.